You're listening to the Sting of Mortality, Chapter 5, In the Dark. A woman's shrill, shrieking scream rang through the town, penetrating the boarded windows and rattled the walls. Leclove's spoon fell from his hand into the bowl of fish stew. He looked around the tavern. The men stared into space complacently, many now too inebriated to rise. The tavern maid hurriedly bolted the door. Leclove's hackles rose as the woman's screams came again, pleading for help. He couldn't stand it anymore. He rose from his bar stool and headed for the door.
"What are you doing? Get away from there!" the tavern maid shouted.
A man tried to block his path, but he was drunk, and Leclove easily pushed him out of the way. Whatever may be out there, he would find out. If it was a trap, then they were in for more than they had bargained for. Leclove unbolted the door and pushed it open, and a stream of light spilled out onto the dirt road. A woman with long, flowing, dark brown hair and in a white gown ran screaming, banging on locked doors, but her cries fell on deaf ears as dark, cloaked figures slowly closed in on her. "What are they?" Leclove asked.
"They're shades. Get back inside," she insisted as she pounded on his shoulders.
"Shades," Leclove repeated in an inquisitive tone. The woman in the white gown ran, choking on sobs as she stumbled and fell into the dusty road. The masked creatures in black hooded robes methodically converged around her. The leader carried a small, slender blade in one hand and a pail in the other.
"They're like zombies, but much worse. They have sworn themselves to serve the vampires," she answered through gritted teeth, still trying to close the door, but Leclove held it open. "Immortal, then?" asked Leclove. I don't know. I've never seen one die before."
"What's in the bucket?"
"Nothing yet. They've come to collect the blood tax. Now close the door before they come inside and kill us all." She cursed and continued to bruise her hands, beating on Leclove's tough backside. As much as he would have liked to, he wasn't about to rush between two parties before evaluating the situation first. No, he had been taught better than that. The woman in the white tried desperately to crawl away, but the hooded creature stood on top of her gown. She was engulfed between their cruel black eyes that gleamed under their hoods. Her fate was sealed. They had her now. She sobbed, knowing what they would do next. She was going to die, very, very slowly. The hooded creature stooped down with its slender blade in a slow, phantasmic motion. They never saw Leclove running straight at them. Their eyes were on their victim. They never heard him because their ears delighted in their victim's scream. Cold steel glinted in the moonlight. Frigid blood was spilled on the dusty road. The slender knife and wooden pail fell from the creature's hand as it died without a word. By the time the shades were even aware of Leclove's presence, his sword had been bathed in their blood, and he stood between them and their prey.
Before the shades could draw their swords, the Clove had slain the second, decapitated the third, and cleaved off the hand of yet another. The Clove ducked easily out of the way of a desperate swing and thrust his sword through the creature's rib cage to his right. The Clove snarled as he tried to wrench the blade from the dying shade. Its eyes sparkled dully as it stared up at him, gripping the blade with both hands, refusing to let it go. Before he could take his sword from the corpse at his feet, while his blade was trapped, the wounded shade to his left continued after him, trying to pull him down with its one remaining hand. The Clove growled as he pulled the shade's hood over its gleaming black eyes, wrenched his sword free, and crushed the shade's soft, decaying skull with the pommel of his sword. But he had not won. Far from it, as he soon found himself surrounded 14-1, and the element of surprise was now gone. With drawn swords, the shades began to close in around him. The Clove feigned right. The shades held their ground, keeping their gleaming blades on guard. The Clove sprang to the left, tackling a shade while it had exposed itself with the intentions of striking him down when his back was turned. The Clove and the creature snarled and thrashed as they twisted in the air. The shade triumphantly pinned him to the ground, but it was surprised to find a dagger stuck through its chest, one that he had forged himself. The Clove threw the dying creature off him. The shade's swords glinted hungrily in the darkness as they sought to claim his life. The Clove ripped the blade from the shade's chest and threw his dagger at the closest shade's heart. The dagger, however, missed entirely, but caught the shade behind it in the upper thigh. The wounded creature fell to a knee and hissed in rage. The Clove sprang to his feet, cursing as he engaged the next incoming shade sooner than he would have liked. Their blades clashed together. Using brute force, he charged at the creature and sent him tumbling over the top of the wounded shade that was kneeling behind it, causing him to trip and fall. But before he could finish him off, he was confronted with yet another shade. Bright metallic sparks lit up the darkness as the Clove violently parried away the incoming maelstrom of steel before he was able to manage to strike back with a quick slash across the shade's rib cage. It hissed in anger and swung at the Clove fiercely. The Clove was quick to duck out of the way, and faster still to drive his blade through the shade's heart, and violently threw the dying creature to the ground, and turned about, searching for the next one. The remaining shades kept their distance. One began to edge toward the girl, but the young warrior quickly intervened, and the vile creature backed away. The Clove could feel himself shaking. His breathing was a hoarse growl, and his nostrils flared. He felt so strange. He seemed to thirst for their very lives. And what scared him was that he seemed lost. He felt crazy, mad even. He felt numb in a way. And he liked it. He had never felt this way before. He hated the vile creatures, but he loved killing them more. "Come on," he called out after them, but it was not out of bluff or bluster. He wanted them to come back. He wanted to kill them all. The Clove's hands and blades were soaked with the frigid black life fluid of the slain shades. Yet still the berserker animal rage inside him was not satisfied. He wanted more. Creatures in the shadows screamed. Dogs howled at the full moon. Gasps and shrieks echoed in the darkness. Le Clove raised his sword over his head and roared, calling them back to fight. But the shades fled into darkness. And then all was silent, save for the sobs of the woman at Le Clove's feet. He bent down to help her, but she let out a panicked scream, louder than before, and wrenched out of Le Clove's arms and flailed on the ground as she cried hysterically. Becoming self-aware of the mess he had made, Le Clove tried to cleanse his hands on his trousers, but it only made things worse. Curious eyes peered through the cracks and behind shuttered windows, and the few that dared wandered out into the street. "I am here to help," Le Clove assured her. The girl in the dirty white gown didn't reply. "Where do you live?" he asked. But she didn't speak to him. Le Clove sighed. He couldn't leave her there in the street like this. "They have gone away," he tried to comfort her. Not sure what else to do, he guided the woman into the tavern. Le Clove found the door bolted from the inside, and he growled in annoyance and kicked the door in. The customers quickly migrated to the far end of the tavern and stared at him as if he were some kind of phantom or monster. Le Clove reeked of death, and his hair was sticky. His yellow eyes glowed like the harvest moon beneath a mask of inky black blood. The young warrior barred a brazen white grin to his petrified audience as he strolled back over to his seat and ordered another bowl of soup for the woman. "It will help you feel better," he encouraged her. Le Clove watched patiently as her hands trembled with every tiny bite. Her hazel eyes were still glazed and flush red from tears. She was not much younger than Le Clove. "What's your name?" he asked. You should go. They'll be back," she whispered. "And where will you go?" inquired Le Clove. But she pushed the half-empty bowl of stew away and turned away from him. So they send you as a peace offering," Le Clove scowled in disgust. "It is better for everyone this way," she insisted. "A willing sacrifice, then. How charitable. You didn't look so willing when they were about to bleed you dry," Le Clove exploded, flashing hot glances around the morbid tavern. "You don't understand. The last time trouble was made, half the village was slaughtered." She tried to reason, but Le Clove cut her off. "You're right. I should mind my own business. And maybe you could act more like a volunteer and smile while they kill you," he cursed in disgust. "You don't," she tried to reason. "I should just order a big glass of vinegar, like the rest of the cowards in here, and forget about it. I have seen this before," Le Clove railed on. "They at least could make a drinking song for you. After all, the vampires won't be thirsty. At least until they want another sacrifice. Who's next?" Le Clove spun around and pointed randomly to the blonde-haired tavern maid. "You?" She screamed, and the clay pitcher of beer slid from her frightened hands and shattered onto the floor. She spun around the room in horror, hoping to find some assurance from the elders, but they only stared hollowly into their mugs. The woman in the white gown grabbed hold of the clove.
"You must go. They'll come for you too."
"Then I'll meet them with steel in my hand," he vowed, and then hopped up onto the counter. "If I can blind Enthrallin, we surely can deal with a few vampires. I cannot defeat them alone, but we can. Who will fight with me?" he called.
"But we can't kill vampires," exclaimed someone in the back corner.
"If it bleeds, it can be killed," the clove shouted back fearlessly. The tavern was silent again.
Have you ever killed a vampire before?" asked the barmaid.
For a brief moment, everyone in the tavern paused and waited for the young, overly zealous warrior's reply. The clove clenched his teeth. He wanted to lie and say yes, but he didn't, and immediately regretted it. "No, but we can make them wish they were dead. Dry them out! Who's with me?" he shouted. No one stirred. The clove raised his bloody sword in the air. "Who's with me?" he asked again. The awkward silence continued. "Who's with me?" he asked for the third time. One by one, they all turned away. The clove hopped down to the floor and ripped off a cloth from a table, letting the still full beer mugs slosh onto the floor as he cleaned his sword and paid for his meal and the spilled drinks. The men at the table didn't so much as look at him. With nothing else to say and nothing else to do, the clove flipped over a table on his way out and slammed the door shut behind him. However, the night was far from over. Just as he reclaimed his dagger from a shade's falling corpse and go on about his way, he stiffened when he saw the long shadow of a woman with a sword at her hip. The first thing that came to mind was Loida, but when he looked up, he quickly realized it was another vampire. Her long red hair flowed over her studded black coat, and her inquisitive jet-black eyes gazed down at him, while her fingers slid thoughtfully along the hilt of her sword. The clove frowned, and his hand strayed toward the hilt of his own sword, ready to draw. "Were those your shades?" he demanded. The mysterious woman grinned as she revealed her fangs. "That was a brave thing you did," she remarked. Of all things, the clove had not been expecting a compliment, and it took him off guard. "You work for my father, don't you?" she said at last, but the dry monotone and general apathy and whether he replied or not indicated that it was merely a rhetorical statement rather than a question. He never mentioned that he had a daughter, the clove commented. For a moment he saw her pitch-black eyes grow distant, and a hint of pain that was plain at first, and then vanished nearly as soon as it had appeared. "Yeah, that was my old life," she said before she slowly began to retreat back into the shadows. The clove cursed under his breath and quickly stepped forward. "Wait, what's your name?" he asked, but just as he thought she was gone, she reappeared, behind him. "What are you?" she asked curiously. Surprised, Leclos spun around and did his best to keep calm. "I asked you first," he persisted. The vampiress laughed. "It used to be Natasha, but now it's Crimson," she said at last. Leclos grinned. "I prefer the first," he announced. Crimson's eyes narrowed. "Why?" she demanded hostilely. "Seems to suit you better." A faint smile came across Natasha's thin, pale lips. "That's because you don't know me," she replied sinisterly. "So, what brings you out tonight?" he asked. Crimson rested her hands on her hips and gave him a dulled, annoyed, scornful look, as if he had just asked why fish swim in the water. "I'm a vampire," she said flatly. "And what about you? What are you?" she inquired. Leclos shrugged. "Does it matter?" he asked. The vampire hissed agitatedly and gave him a hard glare before vanishing out of view. Moments later, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Leclos spun around to see Crimson standing only inches away, her fangs exposed in a devious grin. I can always just find out," she laughed. Crimson glanced down and smiled when she felt the sharp prick of Leclos' dagger at her belly. With inhuman, supernatural speed, she snatched the blade and wrenched it out of Leclos' hand and seized him by the tunic of his shirt. Leclos' eyes went wide in panic. He thought for certain she was about to plunge her fangs into his throat, but instead, Crimson turned away and scowled in disdain. You reek!" she cursed, and dropped the dagger and hurriedly pushed him away. Then she pulled out a handkerchief and began wiping away the black, inky blood and gore from her hands. It took a moment for Leclos to recover himself, but when he did, he wasn't sure whether to be angry or insulted. Instead, he let out a hearty laugh. That's what the last vampire thought after losing a few limbs. He shot back defensively. Crimson eyed Leclos warily. "So it's true." Leclos grinned. "Glad I left a good impression," he chuckled. The vampire smirked as she began to slowly move back towards the shadows. "I would not stay out at night if I were you," she warned. "I'm not afraid of the dark," Leclos shot back with a defiant grin. The vampiress's bright fangs glittered as she grinned. "Oh, I just don't want anyone else to find you before I do," she replied sinisterly. And then, without another word, she tossed the stained black scarlet handkerchief at him and slipped back into the shadows and was seen no more. Leclos caught the handkerchief in the air, and despite being tainted by the smell of the inky black gore, it still carried Crimson's distinct perfume. That same night, the vampire lord, Ebony Oscuro, waited expectantly beneath the cherry tree in the garden inside his castle courtyard for the arrival of his yearly blood ties from the small fishing village and the region he had been entrusted to govern. Although Ebony Oscuro was not particularly great in stature, his thin lips, angled waspish features, and cold, calculating large, pitch-black orbs could cut through stone. His long, raven-black hair was pulled back, and a tight, well-groomed metal clasp that cut was off at the shoulder level and neatly held in place with an ornate silver cuff. Along with this, he wore a silken collared black tunic and flowing expensive velvet cloak that refracted the bright light of the full moon. At last he turned, expecting to see what his loyal shades had brought for him. His thin pale lips frowned in displeasure as he noted the empty hands of the few who knelt before him. "Rise," he commanded, but the shades did not rise, keeping their heads bowed low. "Where is Malice?" the vampire asked. "He has fallen by the sword, my lord," came a shade's sullen reply. "Who is in charge now?" Ebony Oscuro demanded. The shade rose to his feet, his head still bent low shamefully. "What of Tyros?" the vampire inquired. "Slain, my lord." Ebony Oscuro tilted his head. "What? How? Who?" he demanded. "By the yellow-eyed one's blade, master." Ebony Oscuro's black, unblinking eyes began to twitch. "One?" he said. "What do you mean, one? One what?" he spluttered. "We didn't see him coming. He just was there. We came for the blood tithe, and he was just there. One?" If it was all possible, Ebony Oscuro's already disturbingly large owlish eyes widened, and he quickly interjected, "I see you do not have the blood tax, so I assume you were unable to dispose of this so-called yellow-eyed one." "We were outmatched, my lord," groaned the shade. 18-1 is hardly outmatched!" the vampire lord shouted, unable to come up with any excuses that would satisfy their master. The shades bowed low and made a hasty retreat to allow their lord some time alone. Only 9 shades had returned. 18-1. While a single vampire could easily vanquish that many shades on his own, yet it was unsettling to hear that there was something else out there, something else in the dark, that was not afraid of his shades, and not afraid of him. Ebony Oscuro glanced up, noting Helix's smug grin as he gracefully slipped past the shades and made his way into the room. "Now do you believe me, my lord?" Helix asked. Ebony Oscuro's pitch-black orbs narrowed at the vampire named Helix and gave him a long, cold glare. Helix had claimed he had lost control of his thirst and had gone on a killing spree after he had suffered severe injuries that had been inflicted upon him from the yellow-eyed stranger. Ebony Oscuro naturally assumed that the gluttonous pig had been coming up with just another excuse to indulge. But for the first time in 100 years, he now feared Helix might have been actually telling the truth. If that was true, the connection between the disturbing happenings were more than mere coincidence. Lord Ebony Oscuro slowly nodded his head in acknowledgement. Yes, Helix, I believe you, he said at last. I only regret that neither you or this yellow-eyed rogue was at least capable of ridding me of at least one headache, he snarled, and then pointed to the door. If you bring me his head before midnight, you will be forgiven. Fail, and I will send you to the Vampire Council to be tried for wasteful gluttony and stirring up the peasants into a rebellion, he snapped. In the morning, Clove went to work at the forge. Business was slow. Smith didn't speak to him for the better part of the day, which was probably for the best, because he was trying to figure out some sort of way of posing the question about his daughter, Natasha. The last thing he wanted to say was, "Hey, I met your daughter last night in the alleyway." No, that wouldn't go very well. They worked in silence and ate in silence. Finally, while they were busy putting things away for the night, the stout, bearded man grunted loudly as if to clear his throat. "I heard a few rumors about you getting into some trouble," he commented. The Clove grinned. "So Natasha told you then?" he asked cheerfully, as he was relieved that the smith wouldn't be upset by the questions he had been dying to ask. But when he saw Smith's face suddenly grow pale, his smile faded, and he quickly realized he was mistaken. "Who told me what?" he exclaimed in shock. The young warrior grimaced and cursed himself inwardly. "Your daughter—" The Clove didn't even have time to finish his sentence. The very stout and strong Mr. Smith. "How do you know about my daughter?" he demanded. I met her outside the tavern," he exclaimed in panic. "You what?" he exploded. "No, it wasn't like that," the Clove exclaimed as the smith picked up a large hammer. "What the hell was it like then? How do you know about her? She is dead!" He snarled. "Vampire! She's a vampire! I swear, I saw her! She had red hair. Crimson red hair," he explained. "No!" Lucius roared. The Clove cursed inwardly as Natasha's father flung him from one arm across the room. "It's okay, she's alive," the Clove tried to console his father, until he was forced to duck out of the way of a hammer that came flying through the room and smashed into a rack of tools, sending heavy, sharp, and blunt objects flying all over the place. "No, she's dead!" he snarled angrily. "She is alive," he insisted. But before he could attempt to calm things down, he ducked just in time as another hammer sailed over his head. "Get out! You have caused enough trouble in this town! Get out! Get out! If I see you again, I'll kill you!" He snarled as he whirled about. The Clove took the opportunity and quickly darted outside before the irate smith could find anything else heavy to throw at him. Clearly out of a job, the Clove let out a frustrated sigh as he walked down the street and glanced over towards the apartment buildings, and quickly noticed that the entire building was suspiciously dark. Not even so much as a single candle had been lit. He had been expecting it all day. He only wondered where and when the shades would come back. After all, he was due for some retribution. The western horizon was a deep red, which was a good indication that the weather would be good tomorrow. Or so the age-old rhyme went. Red sky at night, sailors' delight. Red in the morning, sailors take warning. No job, and no favor amongst the townspeople. He didn't have a single reason to stay. Leaving now, while the weather was good, was tempting, and probably the wisest thing to do. But he couldn't help but feel angry. There was just something about running that didn't sit well with him. The glove glanced over toward the docks, and let out another heavy sigh as he rested against a horse trough and leaned down to splash water into his face, when he heard a familiar woman's voice. "So, this is what you look like when you aren't covered in gore," Crimson remarked. The clove lurched up out of the water trough and quickly wiped his wet, unruly black hair out of his face and stared up at the red-headed vampiress that was watching him thoughtfully. "You are up early," he replied, doing his best to act calm. He didn't know why, but he found Crimson perilously attractive. "What the hell are you?" she inquired. The clove shrugged. "What are you?" Crimson scowled impatiently. "I don't even know why I'm talking to you. Do you know what would happen to me for not turning you in to Lord Ebony Oscuro right now?" she growled, but no sooner had she uttered those words, laughter arose from the shadows. "I won't tell anybody," Helix chuckled as he emerged from the shadows. Crimson spun around and stared at her sire in dread. "I thought I would find you sneaking about sooner or later," she cursed. Helix laughed at her mockingly. "What have I taught you about playing with your prey, little fledgling?" Crimson barred her fangs, and her pitch-black eyes hardened with intense hatred. "I remember." Helix chuckled darkly. "Good," he purred. "Unfortunately, I found him first. Now run along, and tell Ebony Oscuro that I have found our little troublemaker," he commanded. Angry streams of blood began to flow down Crimson's ivory-white tear ducts as she bowed slowly and turned to walk away. And Helix grinned malevolently as he turned to look toward the clove. "I have dreamt of so many ways of how to kill you," he chuckled. The clove's jaw tightened. Just as his hand gripped the hilt of his sword, Crimson turned sharply and stabbed Helix in the back. The glistening, bloody tip of the blade burst out of the vampire's rib cage and out the front of the white lace blouse. Helix's eyes went big, and he stared down at the tip of the sword sticking out from his chest and staggered backwards while blindly and feebly trying to grasp the hilt of the sword that had been thrust beneath his left shoulder blade. The wounded vampire turned, gasping for breath, and feebly grasped at the wooden paneled walls. You! Helix wheezed in shock. Scarlet red streams of blood flowed down Crimson's face as she backed away from the dying vampire.
I gave you eternal life, you wretched whore, he spluttered, spitting up droplets of blood as he collapsed to the ground. All the while, Leclos stood on guard, ready for the vampire to regenerate and get back up just as he had before. But the pale creature lay there, cold and unresponsive. You gave me eternal torment and misery, she spat. You killed him, Glove gasped in dismay. Crimson put her hands over her face as she wept. I stabbed him through his heart, she explained in a shaky breath. Just go. Leave. Take one of the boats tied to the dock and get out of here, she instructed. The Clove tilted his head, his yellow eyes glowing excitedly as he stooped down, studying the dead vampire. You killed him, he remarked again. He had fought this vampire before, but he hadn't been able to kill him. Crimson reached down and pulled her rapier from Helix's back. Go! She hissed. The young warrior's gaze hardened, and a tenacious grin flared across his lips, and he turned and glanced upward to his apartment. They're waiting for you. Can't you see it's a trap? She snarled. And indeed, he could see the entire building was suspiciously dark. Not so much as a single candle burned. He had been expecting it all day. He only wondered where and when. Leclos's eyes sparkled with mischief. I wouldn't want to disappoint him. The vampiress frowned and tilted her head to the side and watched in stunned silence as the peculiar rogue quickly moved into the narrow alleyway in the back and quietly scaled up the drainage pipe until he was able to slip into the side window that he had kept open for the fresh air. In the darkness, Lord Ebonioscuro nervously sipped a goblet of freshly poured blood, with his back turned to the window and eyes fixed on the door at which they assumed their victim would enter. Leclove held his breath as he crept around at the hems of the shades' cloaks, coming so close he could plunge his dagger into a shade's foot, which was tempting, but would ruin his dramatic entry. Ebonioscuro felt uneasy. He could sense a hostile presence was close. The vampire lord wandered over to peer at the window. Nothing. The streets were empty. Is there someone here? A predator in the dark? No. It's only me, he thought to himself. Why is he taking so long? Hissed Ebonioscuro. Oh man, this is a long chapter. The rest of chapter 5 will continue soon. I need to make these in short bursts because I am uploading this on my phone. My internet is very limited due to my location and the national emergency that's going on right now. I've been trying to keep it in smaller sections, around 30 minutes, give or take. But yeah, sometimes we go over. It just takes longer to upload, and when it's uploading, I can't use my phone for anything. So that complicates things. But hopefully that won't be for long. And on to chapter 5 again. Haha!